Dmitry Milowicz. Chris, I just watched this documentary, The Beginner's Guide to L. Ron Hubbard, expecting Hardeep Singh Kohli, the presenter, to be critical of Scientology. I was left with a different impression of Dianetics. Watching this very intelligent and articulate man on a 2-week journey through to his first auditing session, everything the Scientologists did seemed to make sense to me. I've been left a little confused as to how I now view Dianetics, because it all seemed to be so simple, clear, and concise. My question to you is, do you still practice Scientology outside of the organized church? Are you critical of the tech of Scientology in general, or the organization as headed by David Miscavige? It has disturbed me a little because I have been so critical of Scientology up to now, but now have a new openness to the fundamentals behind Scientology. The mind control you speak so critically of, is that referring to the Church of Scientology or L. Ron Hubbard's teachings in part or as a whole? And 1 through 8. So there's a Reformed Church of Scientology, right? Have you done any videos on former Miscavige Scientologists who are now practicing a Reformed type of Scientology? I've always questioned whether the dark side of Hubbard can be removed from the religion and leave a new type of healthy Scientology. Are Reformed Scientologists brainwashed? All right, well, I'm not going to use labels like brainwashed or indoctrinated or, whatever, some derogatory term for people who come out of Scientology and are still practicing it in some form or another outside of the church. That's called independent Scientology, not Reformed Scientology. I've never heard of anybody formally call it Reformed Scientology, so let's clear that up. And as far as independent Scientologists go, everybody has a right to do whatever they want to with their lives. My opinion, since I'm being asked about this, is that it is an utter and complete waste of time. But people are free to do whatever they want to, just as they're free to go engage in homeopathy or crystal healing or sticking magnets over their bodies or something in order to balance out their, magnetic waves or this sort of thing. All of it is just woo. It's pseudoscientific nonsense. And I don't put any stock in any of that because it hasn't, from everything I've ever seen, it doesn't have any proof of being any more efficacious or beneficial to somebody than a placebo or sugar pills and that sort of thing. And that applies, as far as I'm concerned, to independent Scientology, right? Scientology techniques and practices have mental manipulation and, I guess you could say, mind control techniques built into them. There are psychologically and emotionally damaging things that go on when you practice intensive Scientology. Doing some of the training routines or the communication drills or even some of the auditing procedures for short periods of time, is really no big. And that's not going to damage you permanently or something like that. You want to go have a Dianetics session or, do some regression therapy with Dianetics or some light hypnosis or something with it. Go right ahead. I mean, who am I to stop you, right? But don't pretend that you're on the road to a new state of spiritual and mental awareness and ability, because you're not. Those things don't exist. There are no real operating thetans. There is no clear, as Hubbard describes it in Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, or in any other issue he wrote later on. This idea of a being who no longer has his own reactive mind. What is that even supposed to mean? It's wholly subjective, right? And up to the individual to decide whether he's achieved that state or not. And, as far as that state is described in Dianetics, there's much more formal abilities and signs that a person has achieved to this state of clear. For example, eidetic recall, right? In full 3 dimensions, everything that's ever happened to the person. I haven't met one person that achieved that. Or, free from all psychosomatic illnesses. In other words, they don't get sick, ever. Yeah, okay, I have yet to meet a person who has achieved that. Right? So this idea, and there's a whole list of these things. So I say all that because I want to make it clear that if you're doing Scientology outside of the church and you expect to achieve those results, you're never going to. If you're doing Scientology or anything, or Scientology outside of the Church of Scientology because you want to feel better, well, that's easy. There's lots of things that do that. And that is pretty much what I've seen people doing with independent Scientology, is they use it to feel better, and they cherry pick. They pick and choose the parts of Scientology that they want and don't want. And so they tend to reject the more authoritarian and organizational aspects of it, right? Like the heavy ethics and, that sort of thing. Or they'll use it in a lighter, fluffier way, like security checking. It feels good. Or confessionals, right? Security checks is when somebody puts you on the e-meter and asks you questions and you confess your sins. And, there is a certain degree of good feeling that comes from, taking responsibility for bad things that you've done and confessing those and feeling like you got something off your chest finally, that you weren't willing to tell anybody. Sure, of course that feels great, but don't pretend that you're going to be, able to pop out of your body as a spiritual being anytime you want as a result of doing that, because that's just not very realistic. When you get organized Scientology going, and let's go to this documentary and this original question from Dimitri here. I took a look at this Beginner's Guide to L. Ron Hubbard thing, and this was a guy who put this film together where he went to an independent Scientology group and got through some introductory services that are pretty standard introductory services for anybody getting involved in Scientology. And, I've talked about this at length before, and in answering this question, I'll mention again that the beginning services of Scientology are the good stuff. They're the things that are based on common sense principles, tend to make a person feel pretty good, pretty fast, or give him information or skills like through drilling or through practice that he didn't have before in an area that is intensely practical, like communication or family relationships or dealing with his children or things like this. Very, very practical skills, right? It has nothing to do with the eidetic recall and the advanced spiritual states and Xenu and all that crap. All that stuff is way later. So at the beginning of Scientology, you get these introductory things, and those are pretty much very workable. So it's no surprise that you would look at those things or look at somebody receiving those things and think, oh, well, that makes sense. That's workable. Maybe Dianetics isn't so bad after all. And there is where you make the huge mistake that everybody makes when they go into Dianetics and Scientology or any destructive cult group, which is they assume. They start making assumptions about things. Well, if this works and this works, then maybe it all works, right? It's just this automatic train of thought, and it's totally wrong. It's completely unfounded logic, and it's jumping to conclusions that you shouldn't be jumping to. So, that point being made, I didn't watch that entire documentary. I watched enough of it to kind of get the gist of what was going on. And once I saw that the guy was involved with an independent Scientology group, well, here's the other aspect to that. Anything goes. I can't speak intelligently about one independent Scientology group versus another independent Scientology group versus another, because except to say that odds are all three of those groups are going to be doing very different things and calling it Scientology, because they're cherry picking the bits and pieces out of this tremendous body of work that L. Ron Hubbard put together. They're taking the bits and pieces that they like. And that to them, that's Scientology. To somebody else, who maybe has a little bit more of an authoritarian point of view, they can't do Scientology without the ethics part of it, right? The ethics component. Well, the ethics component happens to be right out of 1984. If taken all the way through to its conclusion, to its logical conclusion, as Hubbard wrote it. So here you might have one field group or independent group who uses that ethics, and another independent field group, Scientology independent group, who doesn't want to have anything to do with the ethics. And they'll both call themselves the real Scientology. So, instantly you have splinter groups and what official Scientology calls squirrel groups, right? Because they're going off the main path, right? And Hubbard compared them to going off and gathering nuts. They're just useless activities. Well, I don't think they're useless activities for the same reason Hubbard did. Hubbard was trying to protect his trademarks. Hubbard was trying to protect his income, right? Because to him, Scientology was all about making money. He's not making any money from those guys. So he wanted to do everything he could to invalidate and destroy those groups as quickly as possible, and eventually writing a policy letter called Keeping Scientology Working, which specifically said that if you're not doing Scientology exactly as I say to do it, you're not doing it right at all, and you're dooming yourself and all of mankind to, an eternity of hell and damnation, right? And he used very strong words for that. So Hubbard really wanted people only doing what he said Scientology was. And of course, from a certain point of view, all of these independent groups are doing what he said. They're just not doing all of what he said. If you do all the things he said, well, then you have, official Scientology or what has been official Scientology, and that gets into a lot of authoritarian, super heavy-duty control stuff. And it also gets into practices that are damaging to you. I think after you've had, hundreds of hours of the auditing procedures, where you're being placed under, hypnotic trances and that sort of thing, where your emotions are being manipulated and messed around with, I don't think that's good for you, and I wouldn't recommend anybody do any of that. So my official stance on it is stay away from it. If it's got the word Scientology connected to it, don't go near it. Because there's nothing that Scientology has to offer that you can't get somewhere else without all that rigmarole and without all that nonsense connected to it. And unless you take the time to study all of it, then you don't know going in what this group or this particular individual practitioner is or isn't going to do to you, right? And maybe he only gives you the really good stuff and he doesn't get into all the heavy-duty stuff. But how would you know until you've done it and you're involved in it and it's a little too late for you, right? Because if I guarantee you get involved in some of that more, some of the deeper and manipulative stuff, it leaves scars. And those aren't the kind of things you want connected to you in your life. So my thing about Scientology is I don't really want to see it being, practiced really a whole lot at all. There's a lot in Scientology that Hubbard didn't invent or didn't come up with. And those things you can get elsewhere, but almost by definition because he plagiarized it, right? And the things that, even those things like, okay, the study technology, right? Look up your words. Look up words that you don't understand in a dictionary and clear them up so that you understand what you're reading. That's great. There's nothing wrong with that principle. That principle was not invented by L. Ron Hubbard. He plagiarized it and incorporated it into Scientology. But the way he incorporated it is he made it that the misunderstood word, he called it, is the most important thing in study. And it resolves everything. And the only thing wrong with any student anywhere is misunderstood words, right? And everything else that could be wrong with a student, Hubbard came up with these other ideas, but none of them, they all take a back seat to this misunderstood word. Well, that doesn't happen to be the most important thing in study as far as I'm concerned, right? There's a lot more going on in the subject of the fields of education and study. And there are no one-size-fits-all solutions for everybody when it comes to teaching things to people, because people learn differently. So anyway, that's an example where you take this principle that sounds good and actually is good, and then Scientology and Hubbard add their little twist to it And so then it gets a bit destructive. It gets a bit not helpful. And Hubbard managed to do that with just about everything he touched that is part of the Scientology technology. You take these decent principles like, the communication stuff, or the ARC triangle, the affinity reality communication triangle, and then he takes this decent principle which has some workability, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, and he puts it up on this pedestal where, oh, it's this thing that you must practically worship because it must work all the time, everywhere. And none of the principles of Scientology work 100% of the time, everywhere, with everybody, right? So these extreme things that's one of the biggest problems with Scientology as a philosophy. So that's why I think that staying away from it, you avoid those pitfalls, those landmines that Hubbard laid all throughout the subject matter, because they're everywhere. They are all through the technology. And also, you save yourself from having to read L. Ron Hubbard, because, man, that guy, his writing leaves a lot to be desired. It's very twisty and very tricky. It's very tricky. And it will get you thinking in directions that you wouldn't normally want to see yourself thinking. So, that all being said, I think that's my answer to that question, those questions.